Our next talk is Nisarg Shah, University of Toronto. And Nisarg, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. Great to be here. And so today I'm going to talk about the agenda of designing optimal voting rules via the distortion method. And so this distortion approach is not very new within at least the computer science community working on voting, but I feel that it's still relatively new among the broader social choice community. So I want to take this opportunity to basically kind of promote this approach and tell you why I think this approach is compelling and should be studied further. All right, so okay, so you all know the standard framework of voting with ranked ballots. Here you have a number of voters indicated here in black. You have a number of candidates indicated in color. The voters have ranked preferences over the set of candidates, and each voter communicates her ordering over the candidates as her ballot to some voting rule, which then aggregates all of these ballots into a single or some kind of social choice outcome, most commonly a single winning candidate. And here it's not very obvious how to aggregate this kind of ranked ballots into a single candidate. So centuries of research on voting theory has tried to kind of find ways to compare different voting rules. And one of the popular methods is the Exomatic Framework, where you try to define some qualitative axioms, which voting rules either satisfy or don't satisfy, and then try to find a voting rule that satisfies a bunch of axioms at the same time. And the hope here is that maybe you start with some reasonable axioms, and then you find that only one voting rule satisfies all of them at the same time, and then that would tell you that that voting rule is what you should be using in practice. But often, as you know, this approach has resulted in many famous impossibility results, and this has led to kind of an explosion of voting rules being proposed over the centuries with no clear consensus as to which voting rule it is that we should be using in practice. So somewhat to circumvent this issue, computer scientists, specifically my PhD advisor Ariel Prokacha and his PhD advisor Jeff Rosenschen, in 2006, they proposed what I think is a very different way of thinking about this fundamental problem of voting. So they say that you can look at this standard framework of voting with ranked ballots, but you can assume that the voters actually have more expressive preferences lying underneah. In this case, utility functions over the set of candidates. So for example, voter 1 here has utility 0.7 for the orange candidate, 0.2 for the green candidate, 0.1 for the blue candidate. But as voting rule, we still don't want to ask the voters to convey these more expressive preferences directly to us, because in many applications, this can be quite cognitively burdensome for the voters to exactly figure out what is the utility for every different option. Okay, so we still ask voters a very simple question, which is to submit their ranked ballots. So to compare the candidates by their utility for them. And then the voting rule still aggregates these ranked ballots into a single candidate. But the benefit of assuming that there is this more expressive set of preferences underneath is that even though there's not a clear way of aggregating ranked ballots, if we had access to these underlying numerical utility functions, then there are at least somewhat more standardized ways of aggregating utility functions. And one of the most common ways to do so is to look at the utilitarian social welfare, which is simply for each candidate, you look at the sum of the utilities that it gives to the different voters. In this case, the orange candidate would have a social welfare of 1.5, the blue one 1, and then the green 1.5. Okay. So had we known these utility functions, we can argue that we would want to pick the orange candidate. But because the voting rule doesn't really have access to this complete information, sometimes it can end up picking a suboptimal candidate like the blue candidate here. In that case, we look at the loss in social welfare as the ratio between the highest social welfare that we could have achieved divided by the welfare achieved by the voting rule. So this is only on this one specific instance. We can associate a single number to a voting rule by looking at the worst case over all possible instances. So over all possible utility functions that you can start from. And that would be the distortion of the voting rule. So on one hand, this approach also requires some subjective assumptions, just like choosing axioms in the axiomatic framework. The reason I like this approach is that kind of the assumptions are somewhat kind of easier to agree with. Perhaps the one assumption that especially economists would have a harder time agreeing with is there being kind of this numerical utility functions, especially in the case where the outcome is a single candidate and not a lottery over candidates. But you can argue that even when the outcomes are deterministic, sometimes voters do have some intensity in their preferences rather than just an ordinal preference. Also, you have to make this subjective assumption that if you had access to these utilities, you would want to maximize the utilitarian social welfare. One could ask, what if I want to maximize the Nash social welfare or the egalitarian social welfare? But again, there are kind of not too many choices of aggregating utility functions, unlike kind of the vast number of axioms that we have available. You can also argue that if you have this incomplete information, maybe looking at the worst case multiplicative approximation ratio is not the right thing to do. What about additive approximation, or what about some kind of average case? Again, I would argue that there are kind of very few choices here that you can make that are kind of commonly accepted in the literature. But the nice thing is that once you kind of assume these more expressive preferences, you settle on an objective function, and then you settle off on a way to deal with incomplete information, then it gives a quantitative way to evaluate each voting rule, and therefore it allows you to ask, what is the uniquely optimal voting rule for aggregating these kind of ranked ballots? And indeed, people have thought about the problem of minimizing distortion and therefore coming up with the best way of aggregating ranked ballots. And now we know that if you want to do a deterministic aggregation, so you want to output a single winning candidate, then the best distortion you can get is roughly the square of the number of candidates. But if you allow yourself to output lotteries over candidates, then the best distortion you can get is roughly the square root of the number of candidates. Right. So another nice thing about the distortion approach is that it doesn't just apply to the standard model of voting. You can extend it to more complex paradigms of voting, such as participatory budgeting, which Dominic just talked about. And one thing that becomes very apparent immediately when you start working on participatory budgeting is that there isn't just a unique way of eliciting voter preferences through ballots. There are different ballot designs that all make sense. And Dominic already kind of touched upon some of these ballot designs. One is you can obviously use the standard ranked ballots, where you ask the voters to kind of rank the different projects based on simply their utility, ignoring the cost of the projects entirely, which you can then kind of take into account in your aggregation rule. So in this case, the voter would simply rank the different projects by their utility, but you can also ask them to rank the projects by their value for money or bang per buck, which would be a different ranking. You can also go beyond the realm of ranking and ask the voters to solve their own personal and abstract problems by telling them the budget in advance and then asking them what is a subset of projects that is kind of feasible and would give you personally the maximum total happiness. Or you can set some kind of threshold on the utility and ask the voters, which of the following projects do you think it's worth spending at least $3 on? And then the voters would approve all the projects for which their utility is at least 3. And the nice thing about distortion approach that we realized when we were working on this a few years ago is that it doesn't just give you the best way of aggregating ranked ballots, but it also provides you a way to compare the different ballot designs in the first place. So what you can do is for each ballot design, you can associate with it the best method for aggregating ballots in that format, which gives you the lowest possible distortion that you can achieve with that ballot format. And this number is essentially, in some sense, the amount of useful information that's contained in the ballots in that format, which helps you maximize social welfare. So each ballot format gives you a number, and then you can compare the different ballot formats according to that number. And so, for example, in this participatory budgeting setting, we analyze the lowest distortion that these 4 different ballot formats allow you to achieve. Knapsack voting being the worst. This kind of theta m is what you can achieve by just selecting a single project uniformly at random. So it essentially contains no useful information if you want to maximize social welfare. Rankings by either value or value for money are somewhat better. And then threshold approval is even better with logarithmic distortion. So one thing that kind of we realized when we were doing this project is that you cannot simply compare the different ballot designs based on the lowest distortion that they allow you to achieve alone. Okay? Because if your goal is to simply minimize the distortion, then there is an obvious choice of ballot here, which is to ask the voters to convey their actual utility functions directly. Yeah. And the reason I said earlier that we don't want to do that is because it can be cognitively burdensome for the users. So of course, we want to evaluate these ballots on kind of a trade-off between the distortion that they allow you to achieve versus the cognitive burden that they impose on the voters. And this cognitive burden is a very difficult quantity to measure. And as I'll mention kind of at the end of the talk, there's a really nice future work here to take into account aspects of psychology and human-computer interaction to kind of come up with better models of cognitive burden. But in this sequence of projects, we simply took a very, very simple model of cognitive burden, which is the number of bits of information encoded in that ballot format. And this is simply the log of the number of different ballots that the voter can submit. So for example, if you ask a voter to rank m different projects, then the voter can submit one of m factorial many rankings. And so the number of bits of information contained here is log of m factorial, which is roughly m log n. If you ask the voter to do either knapsack voting or threshold approval voting, then the voter can submit one of 2 to the power m many subsets of projects. So the number of bits is log of 2 to the m, which is m. And so now that we have this kind of quantitative measure of the cognitive burden imposed on the voters, we can start to ask for the trade-off between this communication complexity, which is the number of bits that each voter has to convey, and the distortion that we can achieve. And in particular, we asked what is the lowest amount of communication that we need in order to achieve a desired distortion level T. And if we want to kind of achieve this lowest communication, what does that optimal ballot look like? All right, so this is based on a couple of joint works with Ariel Prokacha, Debmalia Mandal, and David Woodruff. And before I proceed further, I just want to mention that once you kind of go beyond this ranked ballots and you look at any generic ballot design, then your voting rule essentially becomes a composition of 2 different rules. So one is the elicitation rule or the ballot design, which tells voters how to convert their utility functions into the ballot responses that are sent to the center. And at the center, you have this aggregation rule that combines all of the different ballots into some kind of a collective choice. And now I'll be talking about the standard voting setting with a single winning candidate. And I already mentioned that your aggregation rule can be deterministic or randomized. So in particular, you can output a lottery over the candidates rather than a single winning candidate. But note that your ballot design can also be either deterministic or randomized. Okay? And when I say randomized ballot design, what I mean is that, for example, before the voting starts, you can flip a coin. And if it turns up heads, you say that all the voters are going to submit their ranked ballot. And if it turns up tails, then you say all the voters are simply going to tell me their most favorite candidate, okay? Plurality voting. But you still kind of do this randomization before the voting process starts. And whatever random ballot design that you pick, it's the same ballot type that every voter kind of responds to. All right, so here are kind of the optimal ballot designs. If you want to do a deterministic ballot, so if you want to just fix one particular ballot, then the optimal design actually turns out to be something very simple. So if you want to achieve a distortion of D, then you ask each voter to report her top M over D candidates. So the M over D candidates for which she has the highest utilities. And then we also want her to estimate her value for these M over D candidates. So we don't want her to convey the exact value, but what she can do is she can simply pick one of kind of some logarithmically many buckets. So for each of these candidates, she can say whether her utility is between half and 1, or 1/4 and half, or 1/8 and 1/4, and so on. And we can take the endpoint of this bucket as kind of the rough estimate of the utility of this voter for this candidate. And for any candidate that's not one of the top M over D candidates for the voter, we can assume that the voter's utility for that candidate is 0. So with this very rough estimate of the utilities, we can compute a rough estimate of the social welfare. And the aggregation rule is very simple. It's actually a deterministic aggregation rule where you simply return an alternative that maximizes the estimated social welfare. So with some very simple algebra, you can show that this rule achieves the desired distortion level of D by asking only each voter to communicate M over D bits of information about their utility functions. All right, so the upper bound, deriving the upper bound is not very tricky. What's very difficult is to show that this is the best possible thing that you can do if you want to achieve distortion D, which is that across all possible ballot designs, there isn't any ballot design combined with some aggregation rule that would achieve the same distortion D, but with lower than M over D bits of communication from each voter. So I'll talk about that a bit later. One thing I want to mention here before moving on is that is to compare this with ranked ballots. So with ranked ballots, I mentioned that even if you allow randomized aggregation, the best distortion you can achieve is square root M. So if you want to achieve distortion D equal to square root M, then this rule can do so while only asking each voter to communicate square root M bits of information about her utility function. In contrast, ranked ballots ask the voters M log M bits of information about their utility functions. So this asks voters to report much fewer bits of information, and it does so by doing the following. Instead of asking the voters to rank all of the candidates, it only asks the voters to report the top square root M candidates from her ballot, from her preference list. And then instead of ranking these remaining candidates at the bottom of her preference list, it says that, you know what, that information is not really that useful. Instead, I want to really kind of dive down into how intensely the voter likes her square root M most favorite candidates. So it rather kind of asks the voter to estimate her value for the top square root M candidates rather than kind of going down her preference list. So it finds that information more valuable, which I think kind of the important key takeaway from this rule. All right, so if you want to, that was for a fixed ballot design. Now, if you want to be able to randomize between different ballot designs, then finding the optimal ballot turns out to be a much harder question. And here we have to use some pretty heavy machinery from the streaming algorithms literature in theoretical computer science. And in particular, we need the ideas of sketching and sampling. And so let me first take a slight detour and mention what perfect LP samplers are. So imagine that you have this vector X, which is the sum of n different vectors X1 through Xn. Okay? And each of these vector Xi is an m-dimensional vector. And so your algorithm starts seeing these vectors X1, X2, X3 one by one. And every time it sees a vector Xi, it has to process that information, save some amount of information in its memory, and then process the next vector. And at the end of this processing, we want our algorithm to have a very good estimate of the sum of all the vectors, which is vector X. Now, of course, if you are allowed to have order M amount of memory, then you can simply keep storing the partial sum so far. And then at the end, you can have the vector X perfectly stored in your memory. But the challenge here is to do this task with much smaller than order M amount of memory. Okay, so you cannot really keep storing the partial sum. You have to store some more concise form of information. Yes.
Sorry, there is a question in the chat. Dominic, would you say it yourself? Or...
I was wondering whether you know the best distortion when you have as input just the top square root of M candidates, but no utility bucketing.
Oh, yes. So that is not known to the best of my knowledge. And I'll actually mention this at the very end. So this question of what if I ask each voter to only rank the top K candidates and what distortion can I achieve with that information? It's actually, to the best of my knowledge, for this utilitarian setting, it's an open question. What we do know is that with K equal to 1, which is simply plurality votes, you can't get better than order M distortion. And with K equal to M, which is the entire ranked ballots, you can get square root M. And so how this kind of goes down from M to square root M, to the best of my knowledge, is open. But I think that the analysis shouldn't be very difficult. There should be kind of a simple variant of the harmonic plus uniform random scoring rule that achieves the square root M distortion. That should give something like M divided by square root K. That would be my guess. All right. Great question. Okay, so once our algorithm processes these vectors, at the end, you want it to have a good estimate of the sum of the different vectors, the vector X. And with this information, you want the algorithm to do a very specific job, which is to sample a random coordinate j out of these m different coordinates. And you want each coordinate j to be sampled with probability that's roughly proportional to x of j to the power p. Okay, so you want this algorithm at the end to sample different coordinates with probabilities proportional to kind of the sum of xi of j to the power p, and you are allowed some small additive error in the probability of your sampling. Okay, so how is this sampling connected to voting? Well, one thing we realized is that you can think of each xi as the utility function of voter I. Okay? And then the sum of the xi's, which is vector x, is simply the social welfare vector. And the space complexity of the sampler essentially translates to the communication complexity of the voting rule. Because if after processing this vector xi, if my algorithm is only at the end storing some k bits of information, then I don't really need the voter to communicate the entire xi to the algorithm. I really only need the voter to communicate that k bits of information to the algorithm. Now, there is a slight kind of technical subtlety here because the algorithm processes these inputs one by one, right? So in some sense, the ballot design is not really the same for all the voters. This is where we use this additional property of linearity, which I won't get into now, but that property essentially allows us to have the same ballot format for all the voters. All the voters take their utility functions, condense them down to some k bits of information, and then send that to the algorithm, which simply adds that, that information together to get an estimate of this vector x, which is the social welfare vector. Okay, so that part works out nicely. The other part is that the algorithm at the end samples each coordinate j with probability that's social welfare to the power p. How is this useful? Well, in our work, we use this perfect L2 samplers, which were designed very recently in this literature. And what this perfect L2 samplers do is they sample each alternative with probability proportional to the square of its social welfare. And so this gives us some kind of concentration because high social welfare alternatives are essentially sampled with an even higher probability. And so the idea is that if you do this kind of sampling several different times independently, and then take the best candidate that you have sampled so far, then that best candidate is very likely to have very good social welfare. And to see which one is the best candidate out of the ones that you have sampled, you need some kind of estimate of the social welfare of the candidate that you have sampled. It's not enough to just have a sampled candidate. You also need some kind of estimate of the social welfare. And luckily, this perfect L2 sampler actually produces an estimate of the x of j hat for the random coordinate j hat that it samples. Okay, so that essentially becomes our voting rule. We require the voters to somehow discretize their utility functions because these kind of samplers, they only work on discrete information. And then they send this several different independent sketches of their utility function, which is just condensed down version of the information. And then the aggregation rule simply aggregate these voter sketches and runs several different copies of this perfect L2 samplers in parallel. And then each copy returns a sampled alternative along with an estimate of its social welfare. And at the end, the aggregation rule just simply picks the best alternative that is sampled across all the different copies. And then using much more intricate analysis, you can show that this also achieves distortion D. But now we only need the voters to send over m over d cube bits of information about their utility functions. Whereas in the case of a fixed ballot design, a deterministic ballot, we had to ask voters to send m over d bits of information about their ballots. Okay, so now we need voters to send fewer bits of information. All right, so that's about the upper bounds. I won't say too much about the lower bounds in the interest of time because I want to leave some time for the various open directions here. But one thing I want to mention is that deriving lower bounds that hold against all possible ballot designs is a very difficult problem because you have to think about all possible ways in which you can convert the utility functions of the voters down to some k bits of information. And the space of these possible functions, there is no restriction here. So the space of these possible functions is very kind of intricate. So here we actually make a connection to this communication complexity literature in theoretical computer science, which works with problems like the following. So imagine that you have a universe of m elements and you have a number of players and each player holds as private information a subset of this universe. And your algorithm's goal is to figure out whether the subsets held privately by these players, whether they are pairwise disjoint, no pair of subsets have any elements in common, or whether there is a unique element that is common among all the different subsets, in this case, the green element, and the subsets are otherwise pairwise disjoint. And you are given the promise that the input instance to your algorithm will only be one of these two types. Either the subsets will be pairwise disjoint, or there will be one element that will appear in all the subsets, and the subsets will be otherwise pairwise disjoint. So what you can do is you can have a protocol as your algorithm, and this protocol directs the players to write some information about their privately held sets onto a shared blackboard for all the other players to see. Yeah, so for example, the protocol can ask player 1, tell me this one bit of information about your privately held subset. And the player answers that question by writing either 0 or 1 on the shared blackboard. Then depending on whether player 1 wrote 0 or 1, the protocol can now go to some other player and ask some other question about her subset. And then that player writes that on the shared blackboard. And the idea is that with some minimal number of bits written on the shared blackboard, you want your protocol to terminate and then answer whether there is a common element or whether the sets are pairwise disjoint. And the number of bits that must be written on the shared blackboard in the worst case before your protocol can terminate is kind of the communication complexity of that protocol. So in this literature, it's known that even if you are allowed to have a randomized protocol that is allowed to kind of fail with some small probability delta and give a wrong answer, then this protocol must need at least m over t bits of information written on the shared blackboard before it can terminate. Okay, so as you have more and more players, the problem actually gets easier. We realized in our work that this was kind of very close to our voting problem, but not quite enough. So we actually weren't able to directly use this result, but we were able to derive similar lower bounds on some other variants of this multi-party set disjointness problem. And then we were able to use those lower bounds in order to derive lower bounds for our voting problem. For voting rules that achieve distortion D, we were able to show that if they use a fixed ballot design, then the communication complexity is at least m by d. If they use a randomized ballot design, then the communication complexity is at least m over d cubed, both of which match our upper bounds. So that's kind of the tight answer for the winner selection problem, where you want to select a single candidate either deterministically or in a randomized fashion. For deterministic elicitation, so one thing I haven't talked about here is whether the aggregation rule is randomized or deterministic. So for deterministic elicitation, it turns out that our lower bound actually holds even if you are allowed to have randomized aggregation, whereas our upper bound can be achieved via deterministic aggregation. And so what that means is that at least for deterministic ballot designs, there is no separation between the powers of randomized aggregation rules and deterministic aggregation rules. And that's very surprising because if you look at the ranked ballots, for ranked ballots, I mentioned previously that there is such a separation. If you want to do deterministic aggregation, the best distortion is m squared. If you want to do randomized aggregation, the best distortion is square root m. So that seems to be a consequence of using this suboptimal ballot design, which is ranked ballots. If you use the optimal ballot design, then it turns out that there is no separation between the powers of deterministic and randomized aggregation. We believe the same should hold for randomized elicitation as well. And for a while, we in fact thought that that was true, but there is some subtle technicality that we haven't been able to take care of. But we strongly believe that this is the case for randomized elicitation as well. That when you use the optimal ballot design, there is no point of randomizing your aggregation rule. All right. We also extend this work to the problem of case selection or committee selection, where you want to select a committee. Oh, yeah.
Sorry, before we move to the next yes. Next slide, yeah. So here, when you that sub-probabilistic rule achieves distortion E, is it that it achieves for all realization of like random variables of you're using, or you're achieving it on average? So how exactly should I understand like achieves distortion D? Is it like a guarantee, a hard guarantee?
It's a hard guarantee. It's over worst case over all possible instances. So all possible combinations of utility functions that the voters can have, it will always output a candidate that has social welfare no more than D times the highest possible social welfare in that instance. Sorry, it will always output a candidate that has social welfare at least 1 over D times the highest possible social welfare in that instance.
Okay.
So it's a hard guarantee. All right. Okay, so we are also able to extend this analysis to a committee selection where we want to select a committee of K candidates, and we work with the interpretation where a voter's utility for a committee is her maximum utility for any candidate in the committee. Okay, so this committee selection problem essentially kind of becomes a coverage problem where in your committee, if you already include some of the candidates that make some voters very happy, then there's no point of selecting other candidates that also make the same voters kind of more happy. You might want to kind of select other candidates that make some other voters happy. So this particular utility model comes up, essentially yields very kind of fair committees in conceptually. And so one thing I want to mention here is that a priori, it's not even clear what the impact of the number K, which is the number of candidates in the committee, what that does to distortion. Because on one hand, if you have the flexibility of choosing more candidates, then of course your voting rule can achieve higher social welfare because it can make more and more voters happy. But on the other hand, the optimal social welfare that you can achieve also goes up. Yeah. So the distortion, which is the ratio between the optimal social welfare and the social welfare achieved by your algorithm, it's not clear how the distortion varies with K. And what we are able to show is that the problem actually does get easier as K increases. The distortion, the smallest communication that you need to achieve distortion D actually goes down linearly in K. All right. So that's all I want to mention in terms of the work so far. I want to point out a number of different directions for future work. So first is regarding ballot design. So I mentioned kind of this direction of optimizing the ballot design over the space of all possible ballots, but you can imagine that not all ballots are kind of reasonable to implement in practice. So one obvious question is to work with some common ballot designs, such as Dominic mentioned, asking voters to report their top K rankings. So just rank the K most favorite candidates, or ask voters to compare pairs of candidates or pairs of lotteries over candidates, or asking voters questions like, do you like candidate A at least twice as much as candidate B? Okay, so especially for the economists in the audience, this can be really naughty questions because it's not clear how the voters are supposed to evaluate whether they like some candidate at least twice as much as some other candidate, especially if you kind of don't have an actual utility function underneath. But these are the type of input formats that people have thought about in the literature. The other direction is to actually still optimize over the space of all ballot designs, but to actually come up with more reasonable models of cognitive burden. And this, as I said, is a very complex question that of course touches upon aspects of psychology and human-computer interaction. And actually, with some collaborators, we are right now running some crowdsourcing experiments with on participatory budgeting to try and better understand what the cognitive burden of different input formats is like. Another direction is to actually model voter errors in answering the different ballots. So as ballots become more and more expressive, it doesn't just increase the cognitive burden on the voters, but as a consequence, it also makes the voters more likely to make errors in converting their underlying preferences to that ballot response. Okay, so for example, if you ask the voters to simply pick their top candidate, the voters are more likely to do so accurately than if you ask the voters to rank all of the 100 candidates. I also want to mention that there are also some intangible aspects of ballot design that I don't know how to take care of technically, but it would be nice to also keep them in mind. For example, when Ariel and I were talking to this participatory budgeting team in Barcelona, they mentioned that they use knapsack votes and they kind of understand that knapsack votes might be bad from the distortion perspective, but they still really like this voting format because it educates the voters regarding the limitations imposed by the budget. So for example, if you just do approval voting and you ask voters to approve an unlimited number of projects, then voters might end up approving like 20 or 25 projects. And then when the city at the end approves or like funds only 3 of the projects, then the voters can get angry. Whereas if you do knapsack voting, the voters can play around with the budget that they have and realize that, you know what, with this budget, I'm only really able to put like 3 or 4 projects in my knapsack, and therefore they wouldn't be as upset when the city only is able to fund 3 projects. Another future work direction is to look at metric distortion, which is kind of the flip side of this utilitarian world. In metric distortion, instead of voters having utilities for candidates, they have costs for the candidates. And these costs are originated from an embedding of the voters and candidates in some underlying ideological metric space. So you can think of like the 2-dimensional metric space of left versus right on social versus economic axis, or you can think of a more kind of a higher dimensional metric space. And so even with ranked ballots, this is pretty understudied. So the optimal distortion that you can achieve with deterministic aggregation was only settled last year in our Fox 2020 paper, and this is known to be now 3. And the optimal distortion you can achieve with randomized aggregation is still an open question. And it's largely open to kind of study other ballot formats and even kind of design the optimal ballot format. The other direction is to reconcile this distortion approach with some of the more classical considerations that have been looked at in social choice, such as truthfulness. So for example, with ranked ballots, it's known that this square root M distortion that you can achieve with a randomized rule, you can actually achieve with a truthful randomized rule. Okay? But with other ballot formats, it's not clear how compatible truthfulness is with distortion. You can also look at whether you can achieve low distortion while satisfying some of the classical kind of social choice axioms like monotonicity. So that's, as far as I know, is an open question. There's also this kind of concern against this distortion approach that the rules that come out of the distortion approach are not very interpretable. Unlike something like board account, where the voters exactly understand how the voting rule works. So one, there's kind of a philosophical question here that can be addressed through some crowdsourcing experiments as well, which is whether the voters really need to understand the mechanics of the voting rule, or whether it's sufficient for the voters to understand in principle what the voting rule is trying to optimize. So on this website RoboVote that Ariel and I have launched, we do actually deploy distortion-based methods, and we tell the voters that we kind of provide explanations that the voting rule minimizes this kind of worst case approximation of the total happiness, but don't tell them exactly how it does so, kind of as a step-by-step instruction algorithm. Also, if we do want the voting rule to be completely interpretable, are there voting rules that achieve low distortion and do so? Another direction is to extend this to complex voting paradigms such as participatory budgeting, where kind of designing the optimal ballot is still an open question, or to come up with a districting where you district voters into kind of partition voters into several districts, and then each district holds a separate election, and you want to kind of partition voters in a manner that minimizes the eventual distortion. Along that line, distortion is also something that you can use to kind of model the end-to-end voting process. So for example, in participatory budgeting, our community often only talks about that final step, which is the actual voting step, but there's a year-long process that goes before that step, where the kind of different projects are proposed. Then the community gets together and discusses different project ideas. It maybe narrows down the project ideas because it's not feasible to vote over like more than 100 projects. So sometimes it's narrowed down to like 10 or 20 projects. And all of these steps can affect actually the social welfare that's achieved. And so distortion can be used to model kind of the effectiveness of the end-to-end process. You cannot, there are some papers that have also used distortion to compare different forms of democracy, like liquid democracy against direct or representative democracy. Our own paper from 2019 used this approach to compare primary elections versus direct elections. So it's an approach that has kind of a lot of different uses. And finally, you can use this to go even beyond the realm of voting. You can ask this question of distortion, which is really just price of missing information in domains like fair division, one-sided or two-sided matching, say coalition formation in hedonic games, which I know Dominic really likes, or at least used to like, or even graph problems that go beyond social choice. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. It was a great talk. Let's thank the speaker. Do we have more questions online, offline, please?
Felix has a
So
question.
just following up on what
Yeah. Go ahead.
Please.
Felix, yeah.
Okay. First of all, thanks for the nice presentation. So I have a very general question regarding distortion. So it seems distortion is a worst case measure, right? So you measure the strength of a voting rule by its worst performance. But on the other hand, it's plausible that the rule performs well on most profiles, but not on a few exceptional profiles that do not really appear in practice. Because for all we know, social choice is full of these exceptional profiles, the voting paradoxes. So I wonder what your thoughts on this are.
Yeah, so in some of my previous papers, we did do simulations using profiles from PrefLib, for example. And it is true that on those real world profiles, the distortion numbers are much lower than this worst case. You still see some discrepancy between the distortion of different voting rules. So it still allows you to kind of differentiate between different voting rules and then pick the best voting rule. On the theory side, you can talk about the average case distortion if you have some model of random profile generation that you can agree upon. But that's something where kind of a lot of subjective choices come in. A bit less subjective would be a notion of a smooth distortion. So I know that Lirong has been looking at this kind of smooth complexity of a lot of different problems, like the smooth probability of satisfying some social choice axioms and things like that. And so that could be very nice to look at in the distortion setting, where you can say that for any given profile, if you look at some small neighborhood around that profile, then on average in that small neighborhood, the distortion is not very high.
Right. But then you have lots of parameters, of course. So once you have real distributions on preference profiles. So I was just wondering because like,
actually the smooth framework actually avoids any distribution. So it kind of it essentially says for all distributions in that local neighborhood, all kind of somewhat non-atomic distributions. So
yeah. So one thing that got me thinking is that as far as I understood in the deterministic voting setting, plurality rule was shown to have minimal distortion. Whereas it's like most social choice theorists agree that this is the worst among common voting rules. So I thought that there's some discrepancy there.
Yeah, so for deterministic rules, you are right. And this is one of the reasons why I've grown to like the metric distortion world a lot more than the utilitarian distortion world. Because for the utilitarian distortion world, if you want to kind of find the optimal voting rule, I mean, in the deterministic case, it's at least like a nice rule like plurality. For the randomized case, it's a very weird voting rule with probability half. It does something with probability half. It just chooses an alternative at random. Whereas with metric distortion, this distortion 3 rule that we discovered last year, this is a very nice and combinatorial voting rule that seems to make sense even if you don't kind of worry about distortion at all. So all the voting rules that seem to have low distortion in this space seem to be nice and combinatorial voting rules that just kind of operate on the profiles without worrying about distortion, really. So that could be something more deeper going on here, which would be nice to understand.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thanks. Just one more question offline. Just to follow up on what I was asking like during your talk. So if we drop the hard bound on distortion, like doesn't matter if it's like metric distortion or the one that you are using, or maybe not the ratio, but the difference, like regret, like anything of this. So instead of having a hard boundary, I want to have some probabilistic boundary. That's something like almost all the time I'm having something good, or some like overall measure. Can we do better?
Yeah, so that's basically along the lines of what Felix asked. I don't know of any papers that study average case distortion. I've had some students in my graduate course who did some course project on trying to analyze the distortion, average case distortion of some popular voting rules, at least with something like impartial culture. Turns out to be kind of a tricky problem, at least for a 1-month course project. So there could be something nice to do there. That said, not kind of many people agree that impartial culture is the right choice of distribution. So there is a subjective choice of which distribution you are talking about that comes in. Again, as you kind of, if you are able to prove a bound on distortion in this kind of smooth world, then that would imply a bound on the average case distortion for a wide family of distributions kind of directly. So it's something that would be a bit stronger than that. But you would have to talk to Nisarg about this.
Okay, just one last thing. Can I treat your talk as a point in favor of plurality voting? So
no.
why everyone is using
yeah, so I wouldn't really promote plurality voting. Instead, as I mentioned to Felix, I really like the rules that come out of this metric distortion approach. So if you want to use a method to aggregate ranked ballots, I would instead promote this distortion 3 voting rule that we came up last year. And I mean, I gave a talk on ComSoc in the ComSoc seminar about this last year. So you can find a recording if you want.
Okay, thanks. And I think we have a coffee break now. Yeah, right? Okay, so see you all, and we continue in like half an hour or something like that. Bye.